Okay, so my opening question then will be, what's your favorite restaurant in Martha's Vineyard?
Okay, so to be honest, I think the food on Martha's Vineyard at restaurants is like a B+ at best. But State Road is delicious. Beach Road also delicious. I am right outside of Eggertown, so I think the best food in Eggertown is the Covington for like more casual. I feel like the island has more like froofy, like prefix options that I just don't ever go to because the produce is so good. I'm a cook. I go there and it's my happy place to like shop at all the farms and then make a delicious meal at home.
Yeah, I did a reel on Instagram last time we were there, and it was about how my boyfriend was like, I'm going to take you around to all the little markets and we can pick our favorite. Which is your favorite market?
I mean, I'm closest to Morning Glory, which has kind of become a supermarket. Some people up island have their judgments about it of it becoming a supermarket, but still, like some of their tomatoes and their corn, like, is so good. There's just like the biggest variety. And then I go to like the West Tisbury Farmers Market and kind of shop around, like Beetlebung. North Tabor has the best greens. Yeah, you go to different places for different things.
Yeah.
Your boyfriend knows what's what.
We just drove around every day and just ate our way around the island.
fun.
It was the best. So tell everybody a little bit about your career. And I wanted to hear how you landed on what you're doing now, because you're kind of a voice of reason in the wellness
Thank
world,
you.
which has become really extreme. And I would love to get into some of that.
Well, that's a really big compliment. And that's kind of what I set out to do as a non-practitioner, as someone who's just been through it herself. So my food journey and my kind of wellness journey started ironically at the same time. I left my corporate job to write my first cookbook. And around that time, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which I'm sure everyone in your audience knows already. But for those who don't, it's an autoimmune disease that affects your thyroid gland. And I was really immature at the time. I was doing a lot of partying and, it was just like kind of a young professional trying to find my footing. So I basically just like took the diagnosis and went on living my life. I didn't take any medication. I didn't go through the holistic side of things to try and find a different path. I was just like, I'm going to just ignore this and live my life. And basically just slowly started to wind my way down health mountain during that time. And it was also when I was, really trying to make a career as a chef and food writer, and I was doing a million odd food jobs in New York City, and it was very physical. I was working late nights, horrible hours. I was like eating horribly as a result, which is like very typical of anyone who works in food service. You're feeding everyone else and then just like eating Thai food on the couch, like horizontal when you get home at like 2 a.m. So I was doing a lot of that. And slowly I started to feel these symptoms just start to mount. Like my hair was falling out. My skin was a mess. I had this rash called perioral dermatitis, which a lot of people come to me for because it's just something that just doesn't have very many answers. And I was someone who was always a runner. I was always very athletic and physical. And I like couldn't even run down the block without getting these horrible cramps. And my temperature was completely off. I felt like I was getting like menopausal hot flashes as I was walking up the subway steps. I was tired all the time, but I wasn't sleeping through the night. And so eventually I did end up kind of in the office of someone with a more holistic perspective who kind of explained like, oh yeah, like this is all your autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's. Like we got to get you on a different track. And so that was my first time, kind of using diet / food as medicine. And I eliminated gluten. And that was like a really, really difficult thing for me to do as someone who is, obsessed with food. It was scary from a career perspective. It was scary just from a personal perspective as someone who is, deeply in love with kind of like eating their way through life. But I saw a huge difference right away. So, I feel like he did various testing and was like, gluten seems to be the issue. But I also did an elimination diet and I kind of experienced the black and white of my symptoms after the fact. And this was almost 15 years ago. So there weren't the options there are today. There wasn't kind of the awareness that there is today. And I didn't even completely understand kind of the connection between like the molecular mimicry that happens in autoimmune disease when our body is attacking our tissue and can sometimes mistake other proteins that look similar, which is the case with gluten and Hashimoto's, which attacks your thyroid gland. So that was kind of me off to this new this new start. And then ironically, my cookbook was coming out at that time. So I couldn't eat any of the recipes in the book anymore. It was, kind of devastating. I was worried that I wasn't going to get, any jobs. I had grand plans at the time to be like a star on the Food Network. And, I was like, you can't be a star in the Food Network if you have any dietary restrictions. So I basically kind of started on this different path. And what I found was that once I started dipping my toe into functional medicine, holistic wellness, it was like the pendulum swung in the other direction completely. Like I went from kind of denial to obsession. And I just felt like while, the Western medicine side of things, my original doctor wasn't talking at all about food as medicine, there was just this emphasis on the other side of the spectrum that if you didn't do this complete laundry list of things, if you didn't turn your life completely upside down and like transition all of your clothes to organic cotton and like all of your cleaning supplies to something that's like a baking soda compound, then, you couldn't get well. And so I wanted to find like kind of this middle ground for myself. And I felt like at the time that there were other people out there in my camp who wanted a more sane voice of reason, as you said. And so I developed this little project for myself. I was like, I'm going to take a year and I'm going to try on all these things on for size. I'm not going to be like biohacking bro about it, but I'm really going to see like what makes an actual physical impact. And then more importantly, what affects my soul, like what is actually worth my time, money, and energy from an emotional perspective, from a social wellness perspective, from a financial perspective. And I kind of created my own toolkit throughout that year for everything from like sleep to hydration to beauty products and whatnot. And it really it was like my guiding light going forward because I've had more health issues since then. I really did kind of like heal my Hashimoto's to a certain extent, but I also was so far down, at the bottom that it was a really hard uphill battle. And even now it's like I still have antibodies. I haven't reversed my condition, but I kind of have found like my perfect, like living at 80% that feels emotionally sane.
Mm-hmm. I love that phrase, health mountain going down. Because I think so many people have that experience of this kind of cascade where there's one symptom and then all these things kind of snowball and you're just going down. And
they blend together too.
Yeah.
You don't even realize that you're on like the skids until you like land with your ass like thumping against the ground at the bottom of the mountain.
Yeah. Can you talk about the gluten issue? Because I think that this is something that there are so many misconceptions about in the wellness world.
Totally. So I think there are a lot of reasons why we've seen people become more sensitive to gluten, and then a lot of reasons that people purport that aren't actually true, which is, a lot of people talk about GMOs. Like in reality, wheat is hybridized. It's not a GMO crop. It is hybridized to have, higher degrees of gluten, but relative to other changes, I don't think that's the big thing. Pesticides is a huge thing. But honestly, how we prepare our food, how we prepare our pasta, how we prepare our bread. For my latest book, I kind of delved into carbs and how they differ from, what our great-grandparents ate to what people ate, centuries ago. And how we prepare food really does have an impact on how we digest it. So a lot of people, will go to Europe and they'll be like, well, I can eat bread, I can eat pasta and have such a different reaction. And these are people who fall into like the huge blanket camp of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which in theory, that is what I fall into as well. I have like I can't go to Europe and eat bread and pasta. Unfortunately, I've tried. I'm just way too sensitive at this point. But for those people, maybe it does have to do with the pesticides to some extent and the Roundup that's used here. But I think, particularly for pasta, and the bread, it's how it's prepared, like the rise time in this country when we've industrialized the process means that there's going to be a lot more gluten in the actual processing. And there's going to be none of that kind of sourdough bacterial starter to break down the gluten, to break down the carb content. And with pasta, the technique, people will say like, oh, well, the flour there has less gluten. It actually doesn't. It's made from semolina flour, which is a high protein flour. Gluten is a protein. So it is higher in gluten because that's how you get that, wonderful bendy texture and bite to the pasta that the Italians, have been honing for many centuries. But what they do is they allow that pasta to slow dry. they of course, make industrialized pasta there too. But you'll see it on the box, like lenta or slow dried as the difference. And what happens is, and the analogy I give for people who are cooking enthusiasts is, what happens like when you cook a protein that has gone like straight from the fridge into a hot pan, it seizes up, it like constricts. And the same thing happens with the drying process in pasta or gluten in any sort of baked good. So when they allow it to slow dry, the like kind of mesh of the gluten is relaxed. And when you speed up that process and kind of flash dry it, like you do in a factory, all of that tenses up and the mesh tenses up and it just becomes that much more difficult to digest.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that molecular mimicry that you mentioned before and why something like gluten does trigger these autoimmune issues and other symptoms that a lot of people experience?
Yeah, so autoimmune diseases, like a lot of chronic conditions, I've also dealt with SIBO, which we can talk about, like, and many gut issues. Like, everything is usually like a vicious cycle. Like, it's all a circle. So the same thing kind of happens with, the chicken or the egg. Is it the gluten? Is it the autoimmune disease? Is it our food? Is it, the development of these conditions? And it's both, You can never really put your finger on one thing. But I think if you're already in the process of having all of these antibodies kind of flooding your system, as certainly I was at the time of when I took gluten out for the first time. If you add any other insult to injury, so you add another protein that looks like what this antibody is designed to attack, and you add it to your system, you're just going to be kind of adding like fan to the flames. Our immune system is incredible and it's there to protect us. But when it kind of gets its eye off the prize or gets a little confused, it can get A, exhausted, and B, start to attack your own tissue, your own perfectly healthy cells. And that is the case of autoimmune disease. And the tricky thing about it is being able to call your immune system back. And so one strategy is to, again, just eliminate as much of the insult as possible. So for me, that was the strategy with gluten, was to take out the things that kind of were fanning the flames of my immune system and allowing it to die down. And the process of doing that, and a lot of people talk about elimination diets, but if you're doing it like for an actual autoimmune reaction, you want to do it for at least 21 days. That's kind of like the amount of time that it takes for like the battle to die down and like the forces to recede or whatnot. And you kind of have to be strict about it. It's very different than kind of exploring a sensitivity, which you can do, in various other ways. But if you're actually exploring like an autoimmune reaction to a food, that's kind of how you want to go about it. And then when you reintroduce it, once those forces have receded, we talked a little bit about how kind of your symptoms can blend together and you can kind of not necessarily notice like this like low grade, like a low grade issue across the board. But that's kind of like what happens, again, when you just have these irritants in your system constantly. When you take them out and then you reintroduce them, it's like your battle forces are like re-energized. They're ready to like just like jump in. And usually you see like a really big reaction. And that was the case with me. There's like a diet called the autoimmune paleo plan, which takes out like all potential irritants like insult to injury. And I know a lot of people with Hashimoto's who have had success with it. For me, it was way too restrictive. I couldn't do it for a certain amount of time. And I also didn't feel like it really moved the needle for me, even in the short term, in like the dramatic way that I needed it to justify the amount of restriction, which is always kind of like how I weigh different things. But that takes out, a bunch of different seeds, including like cumin and coriander that can have some sort of molecular mimicry impact in the body. It removes all dairy, which, in the case of autoimmune, it's really the proteins that are the issue, not like the lactose itself. So like the casein in the whey. And then it also, it removes so many things, corn, soy, all these other things that, can be wrapped up in molecular mimicry. But personally, I feel like for Hashimoto's, gluten is the biggest thing. And it's not necessarily, going to have the same impact on everyone. Like people who have kind of low grade Hashimoto's or catch it early, like that's not going to necessarily be necessary for you.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people listening have probably had the experience where they've been dealing with something, whether it's a digestive, gut issue, or something else, and they start the process of eliminating. And they might not be necessarily guided by somebody who is an expert or whatever. And I know that this happened to me where I was like, okay, I'm going to take out gluten. I'm going to take out the dairy. I'm going to take out the sugar. I'm going to take out the corn, soy, green beans, like all these other things, whatever the internet was saying. And I did have testing done too as well, but suddenly I couldn't eat anything. And I know for me that created a lot of food fear and this narrative. And you talk about, how this fear can also affect the symptoms that you are experiencing. And I think that this is a cycle that so many people get trapped in. So did that happen to you, and how did you overcome that?
It absolutely happened to me. And I think had I not kind of created this like regimented project with like the goal to be to like run things through this filter of like, is this causing me more stress than joy? Is it causing me more stress than I am feeling like physical benefits? I wouldn't have necessarily gotten past it. And also as someone who's been like a writer and a creator for many years, like I've had conversations with people who were really in that cycle, and also people who have had, like diagnosed eating disorders prior to going on this wellness journey. And again, like everything is a cycle. A lot of people who have had serious eating disorders end up having gut issues, end up getting put on these really restrictive diets. Sometimes they're monitored, sometimes they're not, but they can just exacerbate, kind of the emotional side of the issue that got them into, a place of dysfunction in the first place. So for me, like the bar has to be really high to omit something for a long period of time. And it's one of my biggest pet peeves in the wellness world and wellness culture is like the rigidity and just like the jump to omission, and taking some of these diets that have like really good data behind them, but only as like a therapeutic diet and creating a lifestyle out of them. So we've seen it with keto, we see it with low FODMAP. I have people who write me are like, yeah, I've been low FODMAP for 5 years. And I'm like, yeah. And it's hard, I don't want to pass judgment on anyone, but that's not the way these diets were designed to be applied. And I'm like a big believer in the idea that if you're stressed about what you're eating all the time, like no amount of kale can make you healthy. Stress really does, like talk about data-backed things, like stress really does affect the like primal function of our gut. It affects our ability to metabolize carbs in certain ways. It like raises our blood sugar naturally just when we're in a state of stress. And again, that's creating a lot of issues that in theory you're trying to, nip in the bud when you're going on these restrictive diets in the first place. So they just you end up getting to a place of diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on your Instagram, you've talked about how, for example, stressing over dessert is worse than the sugar in the dessert. So can we talk about that? And I would love to get into some blood sugar myths, because blood sugar and blood sugar spikes are pretty trendy right now on social media. And again, I feel like you kind of bring this really balanced, practical perspective to it. And yeah, I would love to get into that.
Well, I think part of my perspective is that my book before this one was about SIBO. And so I've kind of like gone deep on the Hashimoto's, I've gone deep on the gut stuff. And you find so many contradictions along the way. Like there is really no one size fits all solution to any one person, to any one problem. And so that's where I kind of, start to bristle when I hear like these blanket statements about various things, whether or not it is blood sugar, whether or not it is, information about the gut. But I feel like myths in general for blood sugar, I have a little bit of a pet peeve about the idea of a blood sugar spike in general, because again, I think that can really lead people down the cycle of obsession. I think it's great that people are starting to use these, direct to consumer services that allow people to wear like a continuous glucose monitor and see how food affects their body. I did it through Zoe, and it was, a big eye opener. But again, that was a 2-week process, and I got my information and then I like moved on. But I think it's very different for people with diabetes or any sort of metabolic condition where you really do need to monitor specifically what's happening. But otherwise, I think you can just get so into the granular stress of every time you eat, watching your blood sugar go up and go down. And in reality, that is what happens every time you eat, like unless you're on a carnivore diet, which I don't recommend for many reasons. But, you have to understand like just the exact function of your digestive system, of your metabolic health, that is just the way of life every time you eat. So I think that instead of, trying to flatten the curve and like avoid these spikes all the time, like really we're just looking for reducing the volatility. So reducing like kind of the crazy roller coaster, and then reducing, how many times you see that a day. One of the places where I think like blood sugar science and everything I've learned about gut health through SIBO kind of overlap, like the sweet spot, I think is not necessarily intermittent fasting, but it's meal spacing. So just not snacking all the time. And, again, every time you eat, even if it's like a handful of almonds, which are pretty low carb, you're still going to see, your blood sugar go up and down. You're still going to engage in a metabolic process. Your digestive system still is going to have work to do. And, 100 years ago, our great-grandparents weren't like snacking all the time. So if we can just kind of reduce the amount that we are forcing our body to work so hard for us and give our digestive system time between meals to actually do its job. One of the most interesting things that I've learned about in gut health, I feel like, is the system called the migrating motor complex, which is a nerve wave that literally cleans up after your meals. And I feel like before I learned about this, there was, the camp of like, oh, you should have a lot of small meals throughout the day. Oh, no, you should have bigger meals and space them out. And like there was kind of like warring factions. I couldn't quite keep track of like who was right or who was wrong. But once I learned about the migrating motor complex, which has a really big role in the development of SIBO and IBS, I kind of was like, oh, yeah, it doesn't make sense to be snacking all day. So what happens is these nerve cells only kick in during a fasting state of 90 minutes or more. So again, that means if you're eating almonds all the time, just snacking throughout the day, that really essential process in your digestive system doesn't have time to kick in. And our small intestine is where we absorb all our food. And it is like has more surface area than a football field. It is incredibly craggy and winding, and it's all stuffed in our abdomen. So you can just think about it. Like there's sometimes just not a whole lot of room for, our food to traverse all of these different winding paths. So that's where the migrating motor complex comes in. It literally kind of brushes food through it to make sure that all of the debris, all the fiber that doesn't get absorbed ends up in our large intestine, where it has, an incredibly important role of feeding our large intestinal microbiome. But what happens with SIBO, which is said to be a huge contributor of IBS, is that bacteria, which doesn't necessarily have to be bad bacteria, ends up getting trapped in the small intestine where it's not supposed to be. And that happens very naturally just through the food we eat and our interactions with the world. Like we're always interacting with bacteria. But if it gets, stuck in a little off ramp in our intestines and decides to like, hey, there's food sources here. Like this is a pretty good situation. I'm going to stay for a while. I'm going to like build a colony. That's where you start to have issues. And the hypothesis with SIBO is that it's really a dysfunction with the migrating motor complex that's, causing that buildup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I was talking to somebody last week who had SIBO, and I was telling you before we started recording that I was like kind of informally diagnosed with like maybe SIBO after I had some issues this past summer. And I told you about my solution that I found for that. But she was saying that, she kind of went the traditional route. She did the rifaximin, the antibiotics, and she did, I believe, low FODMAP for a little bit and then reintroduced and found the triggers. But she said that the most beneficial thing for her was not snacking and waiting at least 4 hours between meals. And we were talking about how that is so contrary to what a lot of the narrative is, which is, eat every few hours for stable blood sugar. And it makes sense that you're not giving your body that proper time, to essentially rest and digest. And I think for me, like what, I don't want to get too into it, but like what happened was I was traveling and time changes and, things were slowing down, and it was just that created kind of the perfect environment for that bacteria to be where it's not supposed to be. And I've heard you say that it's not so much, like you said, a quote unquote bad bacteria issue. It's a location issue. And I think that that's a huge misconception around SIBO.
Well, bad bacteria can be the cause of it because food poisoning is a pretty big contributing factor to SIBO, and any sort of kind of viral infection too. It's like the immune element. And it ties back to molecular mimicry because when our immune system comes in to fight, a bad actor, it can damage our intestinal wall in the process, and it can damage the nerve cells that fuel the migrating motor complex. But it's not necessarily like that bad bacteria that takes hold, because sometimes our immune system does do its job. It does kill it, but it's the stagnation that happens after the fact. And it's why a lot of people never really, connect the dots between this like acute stomach bug or bout of food poisoning and these symptoms that creep up on them, weeks, months later, is because it's not immediate. It's like you feel crappy for like 48 hours after a stomach flu, and then you're fine. But then, if a month later you start to have like these digestive issues, this bloating, you're not going to think back to that experience and be like, oh, it must have been that. Because before, in between, you may have been completely fine. But yeah, it takes time for that stagnation to kind of build and for an issue to arise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you are what I will coin the carb queen right now. You have your new book, Carbivore. And this is another area, I think, in the wellness, nutrition spaces where there's a lot of conflicting information, we'll say. And I think a lot of fear still around carbs, even though so much has come out about, how beneficial certain carbs can be, but back to the blood sugar conversation, like I just think that there's a lot of misinformation around that. So let's talk about carbs and glucose flooding, which is something that I learned about from you, and how we can healthily incorporate carbs into our lives.
Yeah. So, again, it's all about finding middle ground, because I'm a child of the 90s. I know you are too. And we definitely took things too far.
Cabbage soup diet when I was in like 8th grade. It was in like 17 magazine or something.
Oh my God.
I've talked to guests about like, what was your first experience with diet culture? And I'm like, cabbage soup diet. I was like 85 pounds, tiny,
I never did it, but like I was aware of it. And I was just like, that, I can't. Again, healthy hedonism is my mantra. And I was just like, I had my eating issues that I cycled through, but I was like, I can't get on board with that.
Yeah. And Atkins. And there was another low carb I remember that was big in high school. And my boyfriend's family were doing it at the time. So it's lots of cauliflower.
And then like Dr. Atkins like died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Sorry. Maybe it's not
R.I.P.
Yeah. But I'm like, that's bad.
Yeah.
Like that's bad PR right there.
Yeah. Very bad PR.
Yeah. So of course, like the packaged food industry, like really capitalized on carbs and like the low fat movement in the 90s. And when we took fat out, like the carb count in our food and the Snackwell's cookies and whatnot, like went through the roof. And that's why we see a lot of, the obesity and the epidemics with diabetes that we see today. So that was all bad. But, I really see us kind of, again, that pendulum swing can be nasty, like ending too far onto the low carb movement these days. And again, like there was first, paleo, and then keto is just so intensely low carb. Again, it's like can be amazing for people in short-term therapeutic applications who have certain chronic conditions, but I just am so wary of it as the lifestyle that's being preached today. And we see it so often, like all these medical interventions that then become like these like diet dogmas that become so moralized. And I don't know, it's like wellness culture just like masquerading as diet culture, in my personal opinion. But in particular, and this is true with a lot of even the data, is that these things aren't necessarily meant for women in the same way they're meant for men. Like women's bodies are very, very sensitive. We're very, very sensitive to anything that can signal starvation. And when we don't get enough carbs, like that is a signal to our body that we are starving. Like carbs are readily accessible energy. Even starches, we have like, and historically have fiber built in, which, helps to slow them down. But still, like they are actual, molecules of glucose that are coming into the body, versus keto, which is forcing your body to find fuel from within and convert protein and fat into glucose. But for essential functions like thyroid function, you don't end up getting enough. And I think women really see some of the downsides of these diets, especially when they go on them for too long. So a lot of women will lose their period, which is like a huge red flag that your hormonal system is not working as it should. And especially for women who are in their childbearing years, like if you are facing infertility, if you're trying to conceive, like most fertility doctors will tell you to eat carbs and to not go super low carb. Again, because we want to make sure that you're ovulating properly. Like our bodies know that in times of nutrient scarcity, energy scarcity, like that's not the right time to incubate a life. So that's what's concerned me the most, I think, about some of these movements is just that women aren't necessarily benefiting from them as much as men. And a lot of the biohacking culture and conversation is being led by men, and being led by men who don't have chronic conditions, being led by men who, you know, want to reach their fitness goals, who want to live forever and, you know, rule the world. And a lot of women, I feel like, latch on to some of the information and the ideas because they are dealing with a chronic health issue that is much more nuanced and that doesn't require optimizing, that requires healing, which unfortunately takes a lot longer. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what your original question was, but I got off on my tangent.
No, there's so much there. And I think oftentimes optimizing and healing are like
they're directly opposed
conflict,
sometimes.
directly opposed to each other.
Yeah. So anyway, that's why I kind of wanted to write this book, is because I was getting a lot of people from the Hashimoto's camp, getting a lot of people from SIBO who had done low FODMAP, which is a specific type of low carb diet, not in the way that I think people traditionally think of carbs. It's the acronym itself is for certain types of carbohydrates that can be irritating, but not necessarily because they're bad for you. It's a lot of really healthy things like onion and garlic and beans and so many
Fruits
healthy vegetables and fruit. Yeah. But it's the actual carbohydrates that, you know, can be sometimes irritating to the gut a lot of the time because, again, you have bacteria where it's not supposed to be. So it's fast food for that bacteria when in reality, you know, it's not fast food, but it's like a positive part of your bacteria's diet when it's in your large intestine. So sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. But anyway, people were very confused about carbs. There was so much food fear coming off of the low FODMAP diet, also autoimmune paleo and some of these other ones. So I just wanted to dig into the data and to see like what's changed over the years with carbs and how can we, you know, like kind of have our cake and eat it too. How can we incorporate carbs today in our modern world, which like doesn't always do us many favors, in a way that's not going to, you know, be counter to our metabolic health, but also not going to be counter to our ability to have, you know, certain hormones circulating in our body, like our thyroid hormones.
Mm-hmm. I learned some really interesting things about carbs from you.
Oh.
So I'd like to go through some of them. So one was that leftover carbs are better for blood sugar. Can you explain this to us?
So that has to do with resistant starch. So basically, carbs is kind of a slang term for starch. So starch is, you know, potatoes. It's, you know, anything that's grain-based. It's basically, you know, just a chain of glucose. Whereas, you know, certain types of sugar like fructose and whatnot, it's different. So starches can be broken down fairly quickly just through our regular metabolism if there's not fiber, healthy fat, and protein, what I call carb companions in the book to slow them down. But resistant starch, which is naturally occurring in a lot of plants, kind of acts like fiber in the body. So fiber, as I've mentioned, is, you know, your food for your good gut critters. And it is a chain of glucose molecules that doesn't get broken down at all. And that is the case with resistant starch. It also doesn't get broken down at all. And it just moves through our small intestine and becomes food for our good gut critters as well. So the beauty of having higher levels of resistant starch to regular starch is, again, you're not going to have that rush of that starch getting broken down into glucose entering your bloodstream. So when we cook a lot of carbs, we are kind of transferring the resistant starch into digestible starch. I mean, that's only natural. We're not going to eat like, I don't know, a bowl of raw quinoa. I mean, you can in like granola, but we're not going to eat like raw pasta. We can't eat raw oats and like overnight oats and whatnot. But just so you know, it's like when we cook these items, we are creating more readily available energy. I mean, that's just, if you think about it, like how cooking evolved as like a way of survival for the human species. But weirdly, once you cool your carbs back down after cooking them, you up the resistance starch. So it's just, it's not something that you have to do religiously. I personally think of it as just like a positive check mark next to more carb-centric meals like pasta when I have it left over in the fridge and it's cooled down again. I know I'm like, this is going to be a little bit better for my blood sugar than when I had it last night for dinner.
And it tastes better, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally.
There's nothing better than next day pasta. Another thing about pasta that you said is that al dente pasta is actually easier to digest than fully cooked pasta. Is that
yes.
true?
So you're going to have more resistant starch, but also again, you're going to be forcing your body to do more work to break down that pasta. So it's just a slower process. I say like my strategy in the book is slow carb instead of low carb. So just figuring out all these small little strategies, all these little tips that we can employ to just make sure that, again, we're not having that huge rush of glucose to our bloodstream, not having that huge spike, just like a little bit more of, a smaller incline, like over a longer period of time. And there's so many ways to do it. That's what's amazing. It's like, you don't have to, make your pasta and then cool it down, then reheat it, every time. There are just lots of different ways that we can tackle this one problem. Adding fiber is one of them. And it's a really delicious thing. I'm personally like, as a cook, like I love that type of challenge. It's about adding instead of taking away. I have all of these like nut and seed sprinkles in the book that are really delicious that you also find in other cultures, like gamasio, which is like a sesame seed-based condiment from Japan, like za'atar, like all of these things, like we actually see if you look back in culinary traditions that have been around for centuries, like you'll see some of these carb strategies already at play in terms of fiber, just eating, an appetizer that has, more vegetables in it, like an antipasto or like edamame before eating your sushi, that's right there. That's fiber, that's protein. So in terms of like the resistant starch and in terms of like cooking your pasta al dente, I think these are things that actually make your dish more delicious. Like, I mean, the Italians have been cooking their pasta al dente. They've been slow drying it for centuries. And that's part of the reason why they don't have, the metabolic issues, at least generations ago, that you see today.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I learned on the topic of pasta is about these pasta alternatives. So there's a lot of lentil pastas,
Yes.
garbanzo bean pastas, things like that on the market. And, I think if somebody prefers the taste of that or for whatever reason they want to eat that, fine. But, you talked about this misconception about the fiber content in those. So I think if people think, oh, great, I'm getting all this protein and I'm getting all this fiber, but that may not necessarily be the case.
Yes. I mean, it is the case that you're getting these things, but it's not having the same protective measure for your blood sugar as it is necessarily for your gut. Like, your fiber, that's still going to pass through again and feed your good gut critters. But the way that fiber works in particular for our blood sugar is that it forms this kind of like sludge in our small intestine. And I'll give you a much like less gross visual for that. But if you're making, let's say, like, I have a recipe in my book actually for this like raspberry lime curd tart. So delicious. But you muddle the raspberries, through a fine mesh sieve. And when you do that, you'll see like all of the skins of the raspberries, the seeds, like they're going to clog that fine mesh sieve. So if you were to pour in, let's say raspberry juice prior to that, it would go straight through as like a waterfall. If you were to muddle those raspberries and then pour the raspberry juice afterwards, it's going to be much more of like a slow drip instead of like this unobstructive stream. And that's exactly the way it works in our system. It's like that fiber is protective. It forms this like literal barrier preventing any, simple sugars from passing through. Well, it's not preventing it, but slowing them down essentially. So that is when we think about, what's in that box of pasta, any sort of processed food, is going to have the fiber broken down into a way that you're not going to get that protective seal. So it's thinking about, the almonds versus the almond flour versus the almond milk, they may have the same amount of fiber on the package because it's the same whole food that it's originated from, but that almond milk is not going to form that protective seal for you. And it's very similar with these different types of pasta. I mean, pasta is a processed food. It is literally taking a whole food and processing it in an industrial grinder to make it into flour. So it's the same thing is true with bread, like whole wheat bread versus, white bread. You may see fiber on the package, but again, it's maybe better for your gut overall than having the like bleached white alternative, but it's not going to necessarily have any impact on your blood sugar.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the last one that I want to talk about is the apple versus the meat stick. Meat sticks are huge right now. Protein is huge. It's so funny that, you're having this carbivore moment because I think that right now it's like you're talking about the pendulum swinging and the latest diet craze, and this emphasis on protein is kind of the current the current one. It's the trend du jour right now. And I've been really open about how incorporating more protein has helped me with, myriad things, my energy. It seems to have helped my hormones, whether I can directly attribute it just to that or not. But like eating protein upon waking instead of not eating for hours, drinking my matcha with maple syrup, and just like that kind of roller coaster that I was on, it really did have an impact in things like energy. My period did get more regular, maybe as a result of not having that cortisol spike or the blood sugar, and just a more consistent appetite throughout the day. That said, it's like we go to these extremes.
Yeah. That's the thing is you can be high protein without being super low carb. There's obviously only so much real estate on our plate for all of these things, but you don't have to take it to the extreme of by being high protein, I'm eliminating all carbs.
Yeah, I'm both. I'm very high carb.
Great.
Yeah.
But see, you manage to have those incredible benefits and those reduction in other symptoms by not cutting out an entire macronutrient. And that's what I'm trying to explain to people. That is my voice of reason. That's what I'm shouting from the rooftops about. So yes, back to the apple and the meat stick. There are pros and cons. I've been doing these like this or that lineups, and that was one of them on my Instagram, just to kind of illustrate like the mental conversation we all have every single day around food. And it's also illustrating like why it is easier to jump onto a trend that's very omission based, because it makes the decision much more of a split second, easy one. But in reality, and if we're going to have, a balanced, healthy lifestyle, I don't know, you can't live your life that way for the long term. I don't think so. I personally have not been able to. So the apple versus the meat stick, it's weighing all the different things, The apple, sure, on an empty stomach as a snack because it has fructose in it. Fructose is fruit sugar. It's going to be in all fruit. May not be as beneficial for your blood sugar. The meat stick did not have, I can't remember what meat stick I chose, but I don't think it had added sugar in it. So it was going to probably be pretty steady for my blood sugar, but it's also a processed meat. And, that's not going to do anything to feed my good gut critters. The apple is like a whole unprocessed food. For me personally, I'm going to choose the apple every time. I mean, I had people in the comments be like, why not both? I'm like, yeah sure, that's great. Do both, ideal. But for me, I think knowing everything I do about gut health, and again, how everything is cyclical and reciprocal, fostering our microbiome, eating as diverse a diet and plants as possible is going to help with our carb metabolism down the line. It's going to help with any sort of metabolic dysfunction. A lot of these things originate in the gut, or at least contribute. It's never one thing. It's always kind of my acupuncturist, when I talk about autoimmune disease, she has the best analogy I've ever heard, which is that autoimmune disease is like adding tinder to the box slowly over time. And then there's usually a catalyzing event that lights the match and burns the whole fucker down. But it's true, I think, of any chronic illness, true of diabetes, true of any of these things. We, do a million different things that can contribute to some sort of dysfunction, and then one thing pushes us over the edge. So I think in my approach, I'm really just trying to foster the macro, large scale processes that I know can help me across the board. And gut health is one of them. It can contribute or hinder your sleep, your mood, so many different, your immune system, so many areas of life. So I think I'm always going to side with the apple.
And there you have it. I love that though. And it makes so much sense. It's kind of looking at, the micro versus the macro, like you said, and not just looking at today, but the big picture and down the line. And, I think people maybe think of gut health as just digestive issues. And to your point, it affects everything. And I think so many people may have these downstream effects of, a gut in dysbiosis or just an unhealthy gut that they don't necessarily connect the dots on. So yeah. Well, tell everybody where they can find you and where they can get your book. All of that.
So I'm a recipe creator, like first and foremost. So I have a lot of free recipes on my website, feedmephoebe.com. And then my new book, Carbivore, is a cookbook, but it has a lot of information that we talked about in the front matter, as they say. And you can find that at carbivorecookbook.com. And then I'm just at Phoebe Lapine on Instagram doing silly this or that matchups.
You're such a fun follow though, and there's so much good information there. So yeah, if you guys are interested in what we talked about today and these really practical, helpful, just tidbits, go follow Phoebe.
Thanks.
Thank you.